I've been working through a couple of things, and I told you last week that if you wanted to go out and read the book that created this sermon series that I'm doing right now, you could go. You can go out and buy the book. Chuck Hodges, who's pastor at Highland Church in Birmingham, Alabama, wrote a book called The Daniel Dilemma. And it's an excellent book. I would encourage you to go read it. I know some of you already have. I know John Thistlethwaite grabbed it, and John Gingrich has it and listening to it. It's a great book. I encourage you to read it. So I'm just telling you that I stole all of the material. So if you're out there listening on the podcast, you say, well, that sounds like some material from somebody else. It's true. Now, I do have my preaching prof in seminary, was a valuable, wonderful preacher. Everybody knew him to be one of the most, outstanding preachers of his day. And as we were working on it and working on our sermons and preaching and doing all of that, he looked at us and he said, "He who is always original is boring. Steal effectively, just give everybody credit." So that's where we are. So that's where the sermon's at. So basically, there's also another person that I've been using, a fellow by the name of Jack Tom, Thom, who's the pastor of a little church in Arizona, and discovered some of his sermons online. And this guy's he's really good. I mean, he must sit all week and just write sermons. That must be the only thing he does in life, but because he's really good. So if you want to go out and Google him, you can find some of his sermons, because I took some of the things off of his stuff. So that's all the disclaimers to let you know that this sermon comes from another place. You want to give me the little thing so I can kind of stay ahead of where we're going. So what have we talked about since we started? And just to kind of catch you up. We're all faced with pivotal moments when destiny is defined. That was our first week. And remember, that was the point where Daniel had the opportunity to not only tell King Nebuchadnezzar the answer to the dream that he had, but he also had to tell him the dream. It's kind of like, how do I interpret your dream if I don't know what your dream was? So he had to tell that. He had to take the opportunity to do that. And then last week we spent some time talking about how we live a godly life in an ungodly culture, and that was a piece where we basically began to look at this is an ungodly culture. We're living in it. It's no longer a Christian culture. It's a culture that is defined by all of the pieces around us, and keep telling us all the things that we believe to be correct are probably wrong, and all the things that they believe to correct are right. So we have a bunch of that going on in our culture, and we have to decide whether or not we're going to continue to live a godly culture. And remember, we talked about that last week and said basically that the truth sets us free. If we believe the truth, walk in the truth, it sets us free in the midst of who we are. Now, so the premise of where we're going to start today is that is a piece that says we're going to either set the culture or we're going to reflect the culture. I've said this a number of times, and so I want to renew it to us. The folks back in the old days of the church that I grew up with really had it right. And that is, they kept saying to us as young people growing up, we couldn't go to movies and we didn't have televisions in our houses for a long, long time, because they said what's going to happen is if you have those things in your midst, there is a culture of disbelief that's going to come into your setting. It's going to come into your brain, so. It was a situation where growing up, the church at some point in time decided that we couldn't go to movies, but we could watch television. Now, I kept asking my dad about that. I kept saying, why is it that on Sunday night I can sit and watch ABC movies that were on, we only had 3 channels, right? we were kind of out in the country, and we only had 3 channels, and so we watched all of those, and so we had that Sunday night. I kept asking my dad, why is it that I can watch it on the television on Sunday night after we get home from church, but I can't go to the movie theater and watch it? Well, that was the same reason I couldn't go to the pool hall. So, I mean, it was kind of there was this kind of this disconnect for me, and there was a disconnect from my dad, and you've heard me talk about my father. I mean, my father was one of the godliest men I ever knew and will ever know. This is a man that wouldn't drink tea or coffee or anything like that because it had caffeine in it, and he thought that was a drug, and so he shouldn't be doing that. And it was a man that would not go in. We lived in Stroh for 5 years of our life when I was very, very young. Stroh, Indiana, up there. And what do you all know about Stroh? The famous fish of Stroh, right? You all know that. I never ate the famous fish of Stroh because they served alcohol, and my dad wouldn't eat in any restaurant that served alcohol. Right? I mean... And we lived through that. The first time my dad ate in a restaurant that served alcohol was when we went to Red Lobster after my ordination party. And when we decided to do that, it was kind of like, I didn't realize that. And my dad had to go to my ordination party. He had to, it was tough. So anyway, that's the thing. So the situation is that we always believed that at some point in time, the culture that was on the television and at the movies was going to have an effect on the lives of the people we dealt with on a daily basis. Does anybody want to argue with me that didn't happen? No, it did. So the situation is that the culture now is established by what goes on most of the time on television or at the movies. And we get our cultural norms with those. Now, I don't know if you watch... I'm trying to watch no television at this point in time because I've already voted. So I don't need to have... I asked the guy when I voted early, does that mean I don't have... that the commercials are automatically not going to be on my TV or on the radio anymore because I've already voted? And he told me no. So, I still have to put up with it, It amazes me how both people on both sides are liars. You didn't respond to that. Yeah. But it's true. So the situation. So the thing that happened is that the culture set it for us. Now, I've talked to you about one of my early favorite shows that I loved to watch was I Love Lucy. We all liked I Love Lucy, right? But I Love Lucy was the first show that really taught us situational ethics and taught us it was okay to be stupid. Really, nobody was stupider than Lucy. And she would always do something stupid, make a bad choice, and what happened to her? She always got out of her bad choice. Amen? Do you remember? I mean, that's always the way it worked. And you just had Ricky singing Babaloo and beating a drum. It was this amazing thing, and he always just bailed her out and said, oh, it's okay, I love you, Lucy, and we got this whole kind of thing. So we began to look at this situational ethics situation. So here's what we are, and nothing's wrong, nothing's right, we're always there. Now the situation is the Bible tells us something different. The Bible tells us that we are called to be salt and light. We're called to be better and brighter. We're to bring light. It's not by happenstance that we sang a couple of the songs that we sang this morning talking about us being the light of the world. And Jesus is the light. He comes into us. He begins to do it. If you want to write it down and go and look at the passage, it's Matthew 5:13-16. So you can go deal with the fact that here's Jesus coming along and says we're to be the salt of the earth. And what did they use salt for? Add a little flavor to the process. I don't know, any of you have high blood pressure like I do. I had to cut down on my salt. I had to learn to eat rotten food. I mean, not rotten food, but I had to learn to eat stuff that didn't taste right, until I got used to the salt issue, right, Bryson? You're with me, so you get used to that whole kind of situation where it doesn't taste like it ought to. I've told you before, my mother, I asked her after I went off to college and didn't have my mom's wonderful corn to eat. I came home one vacation, and all the guys that were talking about how good my mom's corn was, and I said, "Well, Mom, how do you make your corn so good? Because the stuff at college doesn't taste like yours." She said it's called sugar. And I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "Put a little sugar in the corn, stir it up a little bit, and it makes it taste great." So I mean, it's and I'm not 5 by 5 either. So I mean, it's the process of this whole situation. So we were called to be salt. Salt makes things better, taste better, and we're called to be light. We're called to be better and brighter in the midst of where we are. Now, if you go to that passage of Scripture in John, the 17th chapter, where he's with his disciples. We spent some time on this in the past, on the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th chapter of the book of John, where he's at the Last Supper and he's dealing with his disciples. But I want to bring back to your attention the 17th chapter, verses 15 and 16. He says, this is his prayer. He's praying this prayer for his disciples, and he says, "I'm not asking that you take them out of the world, but I ask that you protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I don't belong to the world." So, we're not to be taken out of the world. There's not that point where, I think we need to go off and live in commune someplace and all of us need to hide out and never deal with the world around us. We have to deal with the world around us. We have to deal with the situations that we find it, there are points where we have to deal with the technology of the world. We have to have it. I carry one of these crazy things in my pocket all the time, and sometimes it controls me. I finally read an article where they said that if that people are wasting about 200 hours a month looking at their cell phones. That's a lot of time. What could you do with that time? Well, anyway, I did this morning. So the process is we all begin to take our time, look through all of our email accounts, look through all of the stuff. How often do we get angry by what's happening or not get angry? But I want to tell us that we're going to be in the world, but we're not to be of the world. The world is not to take us over. Now, I want to throw into your being today a couple of words, and those words are the Babylon mentality. Daniel, when he is writing this book, when this book is taking place, Daniel is in Babylon. Now, for those of you who don't know, Babylon is where Iraq is today. So if you want to look where the ground is, that period of time was where Iraq is at this moment in time. So here's Babylon. And Babylon, at that point, the Babylonian Empire had basically conquered most of the Middle East and was in control of that society. And so there was this Babylon mentality that had taken over, and we're gonna pull a few passages of Scripture up here in a while to talk about that. But as we look at the Babylon mentality, it's a mentality that started all the way back in the Garden of Eden. And if you look at Satan's lie in the Garden of Eden, what did he say? He said to Eve and Adam, whenever they were going to eat of the fruit that God told them not to eat of, he said, I'm all about you. I want to help you. I want you to have the gift of life. I want you to see everything. And if you'll do what I'm telling you to do, I'm all about you. I want you to have everything and all this wonderful stuff. And then he also needed to lower God. So what did he say about God? Well, God's just all about himself. He knows if you eat of this fruit, remember that story? He knows if you eat of this fruit, you'll be just like him. And so God's all about himself, and I'm all about you. Now, there's another passage that takes place, and this is a little farther over in Genesis, and since I've been here for that 5 years, I've not preached on this passage, so this is a new piece of information for us in the process. But Genesis 11:4 says, This is where all the people of the earth that were around, and it wasn't a large group of people at this point in time, and they gathered together, and they were going to build a tower to heaven We're going to build ourselves a city with a tower in its top in the heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves. Do you see what it says? They said, here's why we're going to do this. We're going to build this city. We don't need God at this moment in time. We don't need to have anything to do with God. We're going to build a city, and we're going to make a name for ourselves, and we're going to be great. Now, what did God do in this process? If you remember the story, God confused their languages, and they couldn't speak a language anymore that they all understood, and so the whole project fell apart because they couldn't understand themselves. Genesis 11:9 says, "Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth." Babylonian culture, Babel, confusion. If you follow a way other than God's way, it brings confusion. That's all you have to remember from today. Don't remember anything else. So the situation is, and when that confusion begins to go, when I look around at all the things that are happening in our world today, I just want to look and say, how confused can we get? Think about it for a minute. What's all the confusion that's taking place? We're confused because we've chosen not to follow God's way. And why have we not chosen to follow God's way? Because we've uninvited God from the public square. Now, and maybe I may step on some toes here, and I'm going to apologize for it ahead of time, but last week there was a school that on their career day invited to come to their career day a person who was a cross-dressing dancer at an elementary school. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have had a bit of problem with that happening at my child's school. Are you with me? I mean, some of you wouldn't, maybe not, I don't know. But I mean, that was a situation. I don't know about you, but in that situation, that's a little bit of confusion. That's a bit of confusion. And it brought on, and that's the place that begins to happen. We see this kind of confusion taking place all through our society at this point in time. We see people confused about life and what they should do and the process of how they should live and what begins to happen. It's a difficult time for us. Now, not only do we find this Babylon mentality in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, we also find it in the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And here's the book of Revelation, 17:5 says, "And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of horrors and of earth's abomination." So here at the end of the book, we're also talking about this Babylon mentality, this mentality of confusion, this mentality of not understanding what we need to be doing in the world. If you go to the middle of the book, take the Bible and open it up in the middle, you'll find the book of Isaiah right there in the middle of the process. And if you go look at Isaiah 47, it says the same thing. "Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasure, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. Both these things shall come upon me in a moment. In one day the loss of children and widowhood shall come upon me. You in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantment, you left secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray, and you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me." So what's the Babylon mentality? What's the motto of the Babylon mentality? I am, and there's no one besides me. I am. Now, we have to spend a little time understanding God's recommendation. Because when God was talking to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses said he was going to go back to Egypt, and he was going to get the children of Israel out of thing. He said, God, if I'm going to do that, you understand, Moses came out of Egypt. There were numerous gods in Egypt. And so he said, if I'm going to go back to Egypt, and you're going to lead me, and you're going to take me back, what's your name? Who do I tell him sent me? Do you remember God's answer? What did he say? I am. I am sent you. Now, what was God saying to Moses? I'm the only God. I don't have a name. I'm God. It's real simple. I am. Now, I don't know about you, but in our language, whenever people ask me my name, my comment to them is, I am Mark Gough. Right? So every time I talk about my name or I describe myself, I say, I am. I am. I am. I always, just in our language, we put God first. It's a natural process. I am. I am. So every time we mention ourselves, we mention God, because God is at the beginning of everything that we are. So the situation is that when we look at the Babylon mentality, we elevate self. We're self-adorning, self-building, and self-indulging. I'm kind of interested when we go places. How many of you own selfie sticks? Nobody? Good. Well, but I learned when we went, I learned to take a selfie. I don't know about you, but I can take a selfie now. And I learned to take selfies, so we'll just get, I'll post it up later this afternoon. Let me get my camera turned around here and miss that process. So wait a minute. There we are. Okay. Everybody ready? Smile. Okay. All right. Now we got a selfie. We get the selfie of the band. And so I don't know about you, but everybody's taking selfies now, aren't they? We get, oh man, that's the whole thing. How good can I look? Now, and it amazes me that I see all these people, looking at their phones and going, who? So, but it's a process. We're self-indulgent, we're self-adoring, we're self-building. That's the place that we are. That's the Babylon mentality that we have in the midst of our life. So we look at it. We have to, but to do that, we have to lower God. God said, I am that I am. And so, but for us to get there, we have to say, well, God doesn't really love me. God isn't for me. And the biggest one is, well, God really wants too much from me. And so we begin to say that, because what's that do? Well, it lowers God. It says, well, God really doesn't. Well, God's really not out there for me. God's really not there to take care of me. He's not really there to do the process. He's not really there to work in the midst of my life. He doesn't really care about my life. And so we bring God down and we elevate ourselves. Becomes the Babylon mentality. So let's go to Daniel. Daniel, the 4th chapter. We'll start at the 4th verse. You'll want to get your Bibles out because I didn't put this all up. But so Daniel, the 4th chapter. We'll start at the 4th verse and we'll begin to work through. Here's Daniel. In the 4th chapter, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. When he has the dream, he calls for all of his folks, and he calls for all of his sorcerers and all the folks around him, and he says, "Come and interpret my dream." And here's what Nebuchadnezzar, I, Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples and nations and languages live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity. The signs and the wonders of the Most High God has worked for me, and I'm pleased to recount how great are the signs, how mighty is His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His sovereignty is from generation to generation. 4th verse. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living at ease in my home and prospering in my palace. and I saw a dream that frightened me. My fantasies in bed and my visions of my head terrified me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me in order they might tell me the interpretation of the dream. And then the magicians and the enchanters and the Chaldeans and the diviners came in, and I told them the dream, and they could not tell me its interpretation. Verse 8, and at last Daniel came before me, who was named Belshazzar, remember they renamed him, after the name of my God, and who was endowed with the spirit of his holy gods. And I told him the dream. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, and that no mystery is too difficult you. Hear the dream that I saw, and tell me the interpretation. Now, just for the sake of time, I want you to take that home and read his dream, okay? We're not going to read the whole dream at this point in time, but let me just tell you, basically it said that his dream was that there was a tree and at the center of the earth, and the height was great, and the tree got cut down, and all of the foliage that was beautiful and abundant got taken away, that provided food, and all the shade that was there was taken out of it, and it was cut down and chopped off and stripped of its foliage, and the animals flee from beneath of it, and the birds and the branches, and they leave it in stump and its roost. And it keeps talking about this tree and how it gets torn down, and how the fact that there was going to be 7 years, and he was going to lose his mind, and he was going to be out in the desert scratching around and clawing like an animal for a 7-year period. And that was his dream. Now, if I had already had a situation where I'm in the midst of the process, and I'd already seen, I'd been thrown to the lions once, and my friends had been thrown in a fiery furnace once. I'm a little shaky with my relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Are you with me? I mean, I'm not going to say, well, Nebuchadnezzar's going to do what's right in this situation, because I've seen plenty of people get their heads lopped off. And so here's Daniel. He comes, he looks at the dream, and Daniel interprets the dream. And verse 19 tells us that interpretation. And then Daniel, who is called Belteshazzar, was severely distressed for a while. His thoughts terrified him. Did you get that? Verse 19. You want to read that when you get home. Verse 19. His thoughts terrified him, and the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or the interpretation terrify you. And Belteshazzar, Daniel, answered, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew great and strong, is you. And it's going to be cut down. And so he tells him the whole thing, and he tells him the whole thing. Now, what is it in the end that he says? He says that in the midst of this process, when you get down to the end of it, you're going to live as a crazy person, confused, out in the desert, scratching around in the dirt. You're going to grow claws like the eagle. You're going to be chomping around in the midst. You're going to be nuts for a period of time. You're going to be confused. Until what? Until you lift your eyes to heaven and acknowledge God. You're going to be confused until you lift your eyes to heaven and acknowledge God. You know why there's no peace in the world? Do you know why folks are confused? Because they haven't understood the great I am. So I'm going to offer 3 things in closing today. 3 things that I want you to look at, and that's going to offer the thing. The first one is that when we exalt God, confusion goes away, and we begin to see that process. Now, you all say to me, well, we have a tough time, and I try to bring you along. I mean, there are times when we're singing songs and worshiping. You know, I had a conversation with one of my friends this week, and he called on the phone, and we were discussing back and forth, and I hadn't seen him for about 20 years, and he picked my name up off of of something that had been in the college newspaper that we had and that he had, and he called me up and he said, you know, do you really have that many kids? Yes, I do. And he said, well, what are you doing now? And I said, well, in retirement, I'm pastoring a church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he said, the other question is, this a guy that I was in a singing group with at one point. He said, do you still play guitar and sing? And I said, yeah, every Sunday. And I thought about how many prayers over 50 years have I prayed with a guitar hanging around my neck? Lots of them, lots of them. Because I've always played in the church band. I've always, been a part of that process. I mean, it started when I was 13 years old. And I don't know if I ever told you the story, but I started playing guitar at 13 years old because the guys with the guitars got all the girls, and I thought, well, if I'm going to have any girlfriends, I better learn to play guitar. So I got my guitar and began to learn to do that. But in the midst of that situation, it's that whole process of how do we exalt God? How do we lift God up? And I know it's tough sometimes because you don't know some of the songs and they're kind of different than you're used to growing up with and the whole kind of process. So, that whole kind of thing. But it's that moment. How do we exalt God? Now, yesterday afternoon, there were hundreds of thousands of people who were exalting different football teams. Am I wrong? I mean, even at Notre Dame, did they play at home yesterday? I don't know if they were at home or they were at home. They're home. Even at Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana, they had a full crowd of people there, and every time now they have that mosaic of Jesus holding up a touchdown. It kind of looks like that, but they have the, and it's called a touchdown Jesus. So they have the touchdown Jesus there. But every time something happened, you had this whole crowd of people that were just screaming at the top of their lungs and doing. How many football games did that happen at? Alabama. You start naming all the places where hundreds of thousands of people in Michigan. They can seat 101 people in 1,000 people in Michigan for a football game, and they're all screaming and hollering. Now, the situation is, on that day, everybody calls them fans if they do that. But if you come to church and you scream and exalt God, what are you called? A fanatic. There's a negative in that process. I'm waiting for the day whenever the church rivals the football stadium in our praise for God and opens up our hearts. Because we need to exalt God. God is exalted. He's lifted up. His worship is worthy in the midst of the process, and even with that, you all still don't get it. So we're all there. So here's the midst of where we are. The second thing, we acknowledge God. We acknowledge God, that He's written down His Word for us. He tells us how we need to live and what we need to do. And it's not a thing, well, I'm going to argue with it. I get that all the time at my house. I set the rules, and here are the rules you're supposed to follow, and what do my kids do? Argue with me about the rules. That's the rule. That's the rule. I love my kids. But our rule in our house is you can't have a phone until you're 18 and can pay for it yourself. Well, Larissa and Julianne, they're not in here right now, so I can talk about them. Larissa and Julianne turned 18, and they saved up their money, and I took them and bought phones. Guess what happened this week? No. They have the little Straight Talk wireless Walmart, phones, and so their service ran out. On Thursday. Service ran out. So they both came to me and said, Dad, we don't have any service. Can you buy a service? And I said, you got any money? No. And I said, well, what's my rule? And they wanted to argue with me about it. Now, I told him, I said, you realize that I saved some money back from the last time that you had, from your birthday money and all that kind of things. So I saved back. You need $35 to do it, because I wanted to present to them the God situation. Okay, are you with me? So I said, I saved back $30. So you got 30 of your $35. Oh. I said, now if you ask me real nicely, I might give you some grace and pay the other 5. Did you hear what they just learned about God? Not that I'm God, but sometimes God gives us some grace. And sometimes God offers a situation and says, okay, here's the grace, here's the process. Yeah, I've saved back enough. I saved a little money back for you, so we'll go ahead and we'll buy it, and I'll give you some grace of $5. Now you got to work it off. Man, I got my bathrooms cleaned. I got, it was a good day at our house. So that's the place to have. So there we are. So we're going to acknowledge. I will acknowledge God. I'm going to acknowledge that God's right, and I'm going to live according to God's rules. So if you look at the Corinthian passage in Corinthians, here this passage Paul's talking. Let me get it over here so I can read it, because I can't read it up there. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have you did not receive? And if you received it, why do you boast? It's a gift from God. Man, we've talked about that. The gift of God, the grace of God, is a gift. We can't earn it. There's nothing we can do for it. I can't work hard enough for it. I can't get anything. God gives it to me freely, and it's that kind of process. And how do I get a hold of it? I'm going to humble myself. James 4:10 says, humble yourself before the Lord, and He will lift you up. I got into a series of books a number of years ago, back in the 70s actually. A fellow by the name of Watchman Nee. He was a Chinese Christian. He wrote a series of books, and they got translated into English. And I read them as devotionals back during that period of time in my life. And he was the first guy that began to talk about worshiping God face down. And then Matt Redman did a whole album based on Face Down was the title of his work. And we began to look at that whole process. If we really understand God and the wonderful and the mighty might of God and how God wants to work in our lives, the best way to deal with God is face down before God. So we humble ourselves. I'd like to say everything I've got and had in life is because of me, but it's not. It's not. Because of God. And until I understand that, I'm just confused. And the best way for me to learn that is to worship God effectively. So how do we deal with the world around us? Standing strong in a pride-inflated culture begins how? Face down. Begins face down. So I don't face the world around me with pride, lifting myself up. I face it knowing that God is the great I am. Until I come into an I am relationship with God, I'm confused. And if I want confusion to end and peace to reign, I have to understand God is the answer. There are hundreds. One was in the paper a while back that said that people who go to church live longer and are happier. They did research. Research says it. I want to push that beyond. People who understand God's work in their life and live according to God's rules are happier and they live longer and they know what peace is all about. But it starts face down. Let's pray. Lord, bring us into a face-down freedom where we understand that you are the God that works in our life. We're accepted because you're condemned. We're alive because your Spirit is in us. All of that because you died and rose again. You're in our hearts. You're in our lives. You're the great I am who will help us live in a fractured world in a powerful way. Amen.